Today's task. These came from one customer. They are cameras that belonged to his father previously, I believe. Neither of them work, and he'd like at least one back in good going order. So, what are their problems? Well, let's have a look at the 2A. Opens and shuts. Film advance works. Frame counter works. Focus even moves relatively smoothly. Viewfinder can be seen through. Everything good there, but the shutter does nothing. If I press the film release button to free up the film release, I can cock it, can't depress the shutter release button. So the shutter's not cocking correctly. Because I can't press the shutter release button, it means of course nothing's going to happen inside the shutter. So it's certainly got a shutter fault. Something unusual going on there, certainly not good. And its mate, this one, nice 2C, very tidy, all looks good. I've looked through the finder, it's a bit hazy, they all are. There's about 20 glass air surfaces in the finder system of one of these cameras. A little bit of haze on each surface and it all adds up to a cloud. Focus, again, the focus is relatively smooth. If there's anything obvious with this camera, it's the angle of this door. It's pushed in at a funny angle. That should be much more right angle to the body than that. So it means that the struts are bent. In fact, I can see a bright spot there where that's been scuffing. So it tells me the camera's probably been dropped, or otherwise someone's forced that door. So what's its problem? Well, you can swing the film release, the film advance, can't depress the shutter button. If we look in there, you'll see that the shutter blades there are jammed open. They don't even seem to twitch. So the shutter's not cocking and the shutter blades are jammed open. On my 2A, the shutter's not cocking and the blades are jammed closed. So obviously the shutters need repair, but can we find out any more without taking the camera apart? A diagnostic technique when you suspect that the shutter is gummed up with oil on the blades, a useful thing to do sometimes is if you warm the shutter up, you'll find that the oils will soften enough that they become less viscous and then the shutter blades will work again, at least until everything cools down. So what I need to do here is warm this up with a hairdryer and see how I get on. So I'll close the front of the camera, open up the back. There we see the back of the lens. And starting with the hairdryer, which will make a terrible noise, so I won't subject you to it for very long, I'm going to warm this up. I'll do the same from the front. And because the lens can be easily removed, I'll remove the lens. And with all the noise out the way, we'll see if we can get any more action out of this. Well, look at that. It didn't quite close, but it's almost closed. It did close that time. Once more's the charm. There you go. The shutter fires. So that's a useful diagnostic trick. Basically all we've done is warm it up so that the oils become less viscous and sticky, and hey presto, the shutter's working. Will it remain working? Well, possibly, probably not. But it certainly tells me that there's nothing seriously wrong with this camera and that the shutter just needs to be serviced. So that's useful, and it tells us that that camera is certainly fit to be serviced and likely to work well after that. So we can put that one to one side. Now we have the 2A. Will the 2A behave in the same way? Let's find out. Now that lens is loose at the front, which suggests somebody's had that open. I might be wrong. The blades here certainly look oily. I'll just warm them up, and I won't subject you to the hairdryer noise this time. I'll bring you back once it's warm. Well, I've warmed that up. Let's see if we get any result. Nothing. Not a sausage. So we're no further advanced with this one. We don't know whether there's the blades are gummed up because they're just not coming free, or whether this fault lies somewhere else in here. I suspect something else is wrong with this particular shutter. Even though the blades do look oily, you can see oil around the edges there where the blades overlap. Perhaps I can poke that with a cotton bud. Oh, those blades are certainly stuck together, but that doesn't look like our problem. No, it just won't go. So there's some other problem in here, which is not the shutter blades. The 2C was certainly the shutter blades. I think I'll start with this camera, and I'm just going to remove the shutter first and service the shutter, because otherwise the camera appears to work and people might be interested in how the shutter servicing is done. So we've got the taking lens off, so I'll put that carefully to one side, and I think I can lift out this trim ring here at the front, which shouldn't be stuck in there, it should just be loose, and it was loose. That is very oily. You can probably see that oil there. There shouldn't be any oil there. That suggests that the shutter has been oiled, which of course is a no-no. No oil in shutters. So without removing the shutter from the camera body for the moment, let's just have a look in at the front. So I'm going to undo that lock, that pinhead screw, just rotate that so the flat side's towards the centre. That'll allow me to rotate this because this bayonet's into place. Lift that off. Lift off the shutter speed cam setting plate, and again there's visible oil here at this point. And looking at the shutter itself, the main piece here, the internal cocking ring known as the main lever, that looks oily. Looking at the rest of the shutter, I'm seeing what functions and what doesn't. That spring's present, B lever's present. That is sitting in the cocked position, but obviously it doesn't release. That main lever is not sitting correctly. See if I can get that seated. Yeah, it just wants to, it's because it's cocked. Let's remove the main ring. So first I've got to unhook this little spring here on the catch. Now this is not latched into place, which tells me that this isn't being cocked correctly. I suspect there's a tiny spring broken in here, but we'll find out. I'll unhook that spring from the main lever. Oh, normally when I'm doing this, of course, I've got the shutter off the camera, so I've got much better access. Seems unusually difficult to get this out. Just looking at this to see if there's any obvious sign of a problem with it. Can't say I'm seeing an awful lot. What about the shutter itself? If I pull this lever back to the blades open, they do. You can see how oily they are because they don't spring back closed. So there's no danger that shutter was going to fire, regardless of the state of any of the rest of the mechanism. The retard gear train, what's that like? If I hold back the pallets and swing that in, does that swings in? If I lift the pallets, does it start to run down? It does. So the retard gear train works. I'll hold back that B lever for the moment. I want to see whether this lever will cock the shutter correctly. It does. The shutter is in the cocked position. It cocked this mechanism. And if we were to press the release, it would release. I heard the flash sync mechanism run down. So basically nothing's broken. That spring that I thought was broken is not broken. The shutter is just absolutely gummed up. And again, this one's going to be a good candidate, because I believe that with cleaning we will end up with a shutter that actually opens and closes. So it looks to me like both cameras are good candidates for repair. Both of them, their main problem is the shutter. And if it was your camera and if you were just in a busting hurry to get out taking photos on the weekend, you might just choose to service the shutter and not do anything else. So I need to remove the shutter from this camera, and to do that I have one of these Beljan tools, which you can't buy anymore because Mr. Beljan doesn't make them anymore. Occasionally you might see one come up on the likes of eBay, and if you do, well, you'll be fighting with a lot of other people waiting to see one come up on eBay. So let's get that retainer ring loose. It's very tight. That tool doesn't want to move that. I'll have to find a different tool. I have this tool, which I didn't make myself. A fellow camera Retina enthusiast had one made for himself, made for him by an engineer friend, and he got him to make two and sent one to me. It's a very robust tool. This is tight on the thread. Tells me that it's either dried grease that's sticking it, possibly paint. But there's the shutter loose from the body, and there's the retainer ring, and I can have a look at the state of this. Well, the lens for Retina 2A is remarkably clean. You may well know that the Retina 2A frequently suffers from an uncleanable haze on the two innermost surfaces, the ones facing the shutter blades, and it's actually a deterioration of the glass surface. It's not a it's nothing else. Yeah, this doesn't show anything in the way of paint or anything on it, but I can certainly see where this has become mutilated just from fighting that ring off. So here I've got the shim spacers. That's a paper one there, and that was, yeah, there's two paper ones here. They're both damaged. They weren't aligned correctly. See, they've got a little cutout in them. Actually, that's not used on these cameras, but they've been tucked under it. For some reason or another, they've got caught underneath there. So instead of sitting flat on the surface, they've become tucked up against the thread. It may be they were even in the thread. Let's put them to one side. I can find new paper shims. And here's the shutter itself. Now the diaphragm, it moves relatively smoothly. But as you can see, I'll get you reflected in the light. Yeah, you can see that. As you can see, that's oil. Those bright patches there are oil, and likewise you can see bright patches on the shutter blades. So oil is our main enemy here, and given how much oil was in there, I wouldn't say it was beyond the realms of possibility that someone had put oil in there. Just given a little drop just to cheer it up, which of course it never does. Okay, so stripping the shutter down is the order of the day. I think removing the outer shutter case would probably be good, so I better find my all-purpose block of wood. Everything's much better with a block of wood to stand on. There we go. So there's one screw in the case there and one screw in the case here. Neither of those screws were tight. That's not really a problem. One screw just tried to get away. If I slide off the outer case gently, it's still attached by the flash sink wire there. So I've got to unscrew the lock screw for the flash sink. Let's back that up a bit. Encourage the wire out of the hole. So here we have the outer shutter case, and we have the curved cocking rack that runs inside the channel in the outer case. This piece is the detents for the aperture settings, and you can see that the spacings between the settings are not even. That's fine. Into the shutter itself. The shutter release lever handily fell out before, but that would normally just sit in here. First thing off here is the B lever, and the B lever, the screw that holds the B lever has a spring on it, and I'm just unhooking that so it's not under tension, and I can back that up, pop that screw and spring to one side, take off the B lever. Here is our flash sink mechanism. I'm just going to unhook the spring from that, and it just shot over my shoulder, so I'm going to have to go and find that. Normally that would not have happened, that would have just stayed where it was. Two screws, one at each end, one at this end has a shoulder around the screw that the flash sink lever pivots around. See if I can lift this off. It sits over two pins and tucks under the edge of the case here. Sometimes it's a bit awkward to wriggle it out. There we go. That's a bit sticky and dirty, nothing exciting there. Two little brass spacers standoffs, have those out. Our moving flash contact here is held in place with a single screw. Lift that out. This is the 1/500th of a second speed spring, we can have that out. Here is the lever that releases everything. I'm just checking the spring on this because this is where I thought perhaps I had problems with a broken spring. No, the spring is present, so that's good. That's held together with the spring, and I'll pop that back together later. This little cam operates the flash lever to close the flash contact. Here's the pallet, and the pallet wheel stays there. It's part of the plate in the shutter. Now I want to get my flash contact out of there. Now the flash contact, I'll remove that screw completely from the side of the case. It's only a small screw, a little bit more than 1 millimetre in diameter. Be careful not to lose it. A single screw holds this plastic contact in place. And the plastic contact block is made out of some sort of styrene plastic. It's very vulnerable to damage from solvent, so if some bright spark has decided it would be a useful thing to squirt solvent into their shutter at some stage, this can become damaged. And if it becomes very damaged, it just turns to a little puddle of plastic mush. This one's in quite good order. That's very good indeed. Now there should be a tiny plastic insulator slug in there. I'm just looking for its presence. Yeah, it is present. And what that does is it insulates the little black screw, which is running through the case, from the wire, so that you crush the wire to the contact and make a good contact, but you have that little plastic slug in there to make sure that it's not also shorting to the case. So that's good. And I've got everything out of there that I need out. So now I can split the case. And the case there are 3 screws here, and they go through the case into the back of the mechanism plate. Those 3 screws are all the same, so you don't need to be extra careful about those. Other screws around the place, you make sure you take note of what came from where. Here's the shutter split in half. So here we have the case with the diaphragm blades. And here we have the mechanism plate with the shutter blades. So I'll put the mechanism plate to one side for the moment, and I'll concentrate on the shutter case and the diaphragm blades. First thing I want to do is remove the setting lever from the back of the shutter. And if I rotate it into the correct position, it will bring the screw heads into line with these notches in that retainer plate. So if I support that on the edge of my wooden block so I'm not bending anything down, I can get onto that screw and loosen it, and do the one on the other side, and the setting lever will come loose from the back, and it's quite greasy and dirty looking. I'll pop those 2 screws out so that I've got them separate. And those are little shoulder screws, and everything's pretty oily here. Now the diaphragm blades themselves, we have 3 screws hold the retainer plate in place. And 2 of those screws were quite loose. Let's tip this lot out. Okay, so here's our case. There's nothing exciting in this. So all I've got to do is make sure I clean all the surfaces inside and out the thread at the back here on the outside is where the retaining ring goes. The thread on the inside at the back is where the rear lens group screws in, and all this surface in here needs to be completely free from oil and grease. This is the moving plate. This is the plate that connects to the settings lever, so it's swung one way or the other by the settings lever, and as it does, the pins on the blades are moved left or right, which swings them inwards or outwards, because the other end of the blades pivot on these holes in the fixed plate, the retainer plate. All this is oily. I'll put the 3 little screws down carefully so I don't lose them. One of them is stuck in the retainer plate anyway with the oil. Here are the blades. Now it's normal for diaphragm blades to lift out like that in a nice neat rosette. These are just sticky with oil, so they're stuck more firmly than usual. As you can see, when I start to dismantle this, the blades are coming out stuck together. Those are really, really oily blades. Interestingly enough, as oily as they are, if they'd been slightly less oily, they'd be more of a problem. There's so much oil there that they're floating in it. Those blades all need to be cleaned to get rid of all of that oil, which means careful swabbing with cotton buds and naphtha on a suitable paper towel or serviette. Paper serviette is usually the best place to do it. And you've got to be careful not to bend the blades. At the moment they look quite flat, but if these blades get bent through rough handling, then it's a bugger of a job reassembling the diaphragm afterwards. So this for cleaning. I'll pop that to one side. I'll just tip them off there. Let's have a look at the mechanism plate. Now these shutter blades, there are 5 blades. They're all very oily. They shouldn't come off stuck together. They do. They're glued with oil. On the mechanism plate, this little lever is worked by the mechanism, and it connects to the blade actuating ring, which is underneath here. So the blades pivot on these fixed pins, these little fixed pins, and these larger pins here on the blade actuating ring. As they move, they swing the blades inwards and outwards. So this needs to come apart because this is all oily, and of course it's not supposed to be oily. So remove that screw. Sometimes there may be I'll unhook that spring. Sometimes there may be a tiny thin washer on the top of that to take up any slack, any movement, any play. It's not present very often, but it's something to watch for. When it is present and it needs to go back, it's very important to make sure that it's centered correctly, otherwise it won't do its job, or it might jam things up. The retainer plate here, there are 4 screws that hold this in position. 3 of them are short. Now these screws are quite tight. I'm applying a lot of downward pressure on that screw before I started turning it, because I don't want the screwdriver to cam out and damage the slots. You can ease off once the screw starts to move, but not before. Now those screws would have originally have been held in with some Loctite type compound. There's some red lacquer in there. All those screws I've just taken out were the short ones. There's one long screw here. It shouldn't be much more difficult to take out, and it's not. So take note of which screw came from where. 3 of them are identical, so it's no problem. One of them is longer. This plate should come loose, but it appears to be stuck in place. Now it's loose now. So this is stuck. Again, you can see how much oil's on that. It's not supposed to be any oil. Here's the blade actuating ring itself. This is a silvery colour, so it's harder to tell from the reflection whether it's oily or not, but I think we can assume that it is. And here is the mechanism plate. Well, there's nothing left here on the mechanism plate except this little latch here, which usually you leave alone and take care not to break that off. That's a shoulder screw. If you overdo tightening it up, you'll find it'll bite into the mechanism plate and tighten up basically, so that this piece is no longer free to rotate. So best to leave that screw alone. You don't need to muck with it. The retard gear train here certainly moves smoothly, but you might be able to tell that it makes almost no noise, and it's because it's oily. Normally that makes quite a, even with the pallets pulled back out of the way, normally you can hear those teeth whizzing past each other. You can hear nothing. It's just oily. Now that isn't a particular problem for the blade actuating ring, the retard gear train itself, but that oil won't stay there. It'll migrate all over the shutter as when and if it suits it, and it'll turn up in other places you didn't want it to be. So, generally speaking, I do not remove the retard gear train from the mechanism plate on a Retina 1A or 2A or any of these Synchro-Compurs or Compur Rapid shutters, because it's a bugger getting them set up correctly afterwards. If this shutter was set and working correctly once upon a time, last time it was serviced, or even if it's never been serviced, when it left the factory, you don't need to shift this. It'll all be good again. Once it's all clean and lubricated, it'll all work well. But if you take this off to clean it, well, then you can be in for a long time toing and froing, shifting this end of the mechanism inwards or outwards, or this end inwards or outwards. You're changing the engagement of the pallets at this end and of the lever at this end. That seems to be stuck here. No, that's all right. You change the amount of engagement of those as you shift the thing inwards or outwards, and that's used for adjustment purposes, but it's just difficult to get the adjustment right. So these parts all need to be cleaned. Naphtha and cotton buds will be the order of the day. Now there's a lot of grease here. Someone's overdone it with that grease. You can see there's great gobs of it down there. You need very little, if any, in there. I would say the shutter's been serviced before. I'm sort of seeing two colours of grease. Graphite grease here and that more yellow general grease, purpose grease there. So the shutter is in little pieces.